simply to review where we're coming from now, when we talk about Christianity, Christianity is the religion to which we belong to as Christians. What does it mean to be a Christian? To be a Christian means we believe in whom? In Christ. So the unique feature about Christians, to be a Christian means that we believe that Jesus was the Christ. If you believe that Jesus was the Christ, however you understand that, then you are a Christian. The religion that's based, that Christians belong is called Christianity, but there's another word with which we begin this lesson, and that word is not Christianity, but Christendom. We haven't spent a lot of time on exploring this word and what's the difference. Do you notice the ending of this word? D-O-M. Can you think of any other words that end in D-O-M? Kingdom. Interesting. This comes from the Latin root dominus, which means one who is Lord or master over something. So when we're talking about the system that we had set up whereby kings and the Pope were all sort of related, the political ruling of the church we often refer to as Christendom. Christendom reached its height in the 13th century when the popes had a lot of power. What we're going to see this evening is by the middle of the 20th century, the popes will have lost nearly all power. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, in 1870s, we're going to study this contrast, this Pope, Pius IX. We've heard of him before, because he was losing power so rapidly as Pope that he decided that the only way for him to have power was to be proclaimed infallible. Wow, what a paradox. You're losing power, so you have to find some way to increase your power, if not temporally, if not in this world, at least spiritually. So an age beyond Christendom simply acknowledges how it is that now that it was no longer church and state in bed together, church and state united, now that church and state were becoming separated, now what is the world going to be like, not only for the world, but also for the church? The age beyond Christendom. During the second half of the 18th century, when we talk about the 18th century, we're talking about the 1700s. So during the second half of the 1700s, the economic power increased of a new class. What do we call them in France? The bourgeois, the bourgeoisie, the middle class. So before we had the aristocrats and we had the poor, now suddenly we're going to have this group in the middle. This class of merchants and persons who are able to exploit the labor of those below them, and in that way, they are able to accumulate money. We've talked in the past, we said that there are two sources of power in this world. What are those two sources of power? Organizing people and or organizing money. Why did the bourgeoisie have power in this world? Because they were organizing money. They're organizing money. So the interests of colonials here on this side of the ocean and of landowners on the other side of the ocean began to conflict with those of the aristocracy, those who were the traditional ruling class. So before, in our monarchies, you handed down the crown and you had power based on the family that you were part of. Wait a minute, now there's this new system where you have power not based on that, but based on the money that you have. The result, what happened in the late 1700s then? We saw various movements for independence here in the United States. We had our revolution, 1776, correct? July the 4th, 1776, we declared our independence from Britain. In France, we had their movement toward their revolution, their movement toward independence. And also, the independence of most of Latin America is going to be occurring just after this time as well. In Mexico, when was Mexico's independence proclaimed? September the 16th of 1810. So all of that's happening roughly during the same time. But not only do we have political revolutions, we also have intellectual revolutions, which simply means that the way that we're structured is changing, but also the way that we think is changing. We talked a few classes ago about that man Galileo, the crazy idea that Galileo had, that the earth moved. That the earth moves? Look at the sun. You can tell that it's the sun that moves around the earth, right? Galileo challenged that notion. Was silenced and was only vindicated in 1992 or 1993. I remember it was about that period of my life when I remember the Pope coming out and saying, maybe Galileo was right. So there's this intellectual revolution going on too during the 19th and 20th centuries, which for our sake is the 1800s and the 1900s. What are some of the things that were happening during that time? We as a people are starting to figure out that a lot of our knowledge is coming from observation and from experience. How do you know what you know? Because of what you see and take in through your senses, and what you've experienced in life. So maybe what you've experienced is one truth, and maybe what someone else experiences is another truth or reality. Whew, that's going to be a difficult notion for us. New forms of energy developed. Think of the consequences for this. What happens when you invent the piston steam engine or the internal combustion engine? Suddenly, those of us who were remote and couldn't communicate with others because we had to walk or take our horses or some other means of transportation, suddenly we were connected because we could get around a lot faster. New forms of communication arose. So before, in order for me to get a message to a faraway town, I had to walk or get on my horse or find some way to get there. Now suddenly new forms of communication. For instance, in 1837, we invented the telegraph. Are we all familiar with the telegraph? The telegraph was a system of dots and dashes that we communicated through, and that got messages from one city to another. It was a fascinating step forward. After that, we had the invention of the telephone 40 years later in 1877. The telephone continues to be important today. Who can live without the telephone? Television in 1927, we had the debut of television. That was an incredible, crazy way of getting information now. And so we have communication is going to be happening on a whole different level. Today with computers and the internet, isn't it true that I have more access in my computer to more information than, say, the entire Terrasis library that I passed on the way here? If you take the computers out of that place, there's more information on my computer than in that building. Talk about an access to information, what that's going to do to transform society. This is, of course, in Reformation and modern church history. So now that we've discussed the Reformation adequately, now we're really getting into the modern history of the church. What's happening around the world, too, is we're seeing various shifts in demographics, so that Christianity and Christendom before were located in Europe centrally, but now what we're going to see between 1900 and 2000 is the decline of Catholicism in certain places and the rise of Catholicism in other places. And so that, for instance, in Europe, we saw Europe go from 94% Catholic to 77% Catholic in 100 years. That's a significant decline. In North America, we saw North America go from 96% Catholic in 1900 to 84% Catholic in 2000. Even more stark in Mexico. Do you remember the data that we were sharing there about how it was that Mexico went in 1990 from being about 98% Catholic to about 83.7% Catholic today, somewhere around there. So that's a sharp decline for a country to go from being so Catholic to not being so Catholic. What about other parts of the world? Other parts of the world are going from not being so Catholic to being more Catholic. Now what's happening then is, where are we seeing the missionaries come from to the United States? Here in the Roman Catholic Diocese of Austin, if they need missionary priests, they're bringing them in from other places. Where is Catholicism on the rise? Mostly in the southern hemisphere, but also in places like Africa and Asia. In Asia, it rose over the same 100 years from 2% to 8.5%. Asia's a big continent. And in Africa, from 9% to 46%, nearly half of Africa now is Catholic. Is Christian.
What was that percentage in Mexico, you said?
In Mexico in 1990, if I'm remembering correctly, it was between 98 and 99% Catholic. Last time I checked, which was a few months ago, I believe Mexico today is about 83.7% Catholic. Statistically, if you Google online, statistically 1,000 Roman Catholics leave the Mexican church every day. Think about that statistic for a moment. 1,000 Catholics. Over time, how much is the church declining over time? Roughly 1,000 people per day are leaving the church.
To other Christian churches?
We don't have that. We don't have that data at my fingertips, but I have a feeling that we could find that online. Which churches are experiencing growth?
Non-denominational, probably.
Let's come back to non-denominational churches, because we haven't talked about non-denominational churches yet as part of this course. It's really here in the United States now that we're going to start focusing on the history here. We start seeing the rise of non-denominational churches, whatever those are. Hold that thought, we're going to come back to that. Here in the United States, we're going to see a shifting landscape, speaking of non-denominational churches. What's happening here in the United States now? Last time we talked about the colonies and how it was that they brought this Puritan religion over from first England and then to the Netherlands, now over to the United States and in the northern colonies. We had some colonies that were a bit more Catholic, like Maryland. That didn't work out so well. Why? Because it was the Catholic religion was the religion of the ruling class, while the people were of other Protestant churches. And then we had just a mixture of other churches springing up. For instance, with Baptists being more popular in Virginia and in southern states.